Hey, it's Renee with Reset with Renee, and I'm back with season 2 of the Reset with Renee podcast. And I needed a little time to decompress from season 1, and I want to thank everyone who has listened or watched on YouTube, has followed, liked, left a comment on the podcast. I've had some people send me some surprise treats, just acknowledging the content I'm putting out there. And I appreciate that. This isn't a paid service that I offer. It's just me putting my heart and energy out into the world. So thank you, everyone who's been following along, and welcome to anyone who's joining along now. You are so welcome here. So as I thought about what I wanted to do for season 2, I have so many ideas, and I was just really present to the fact that I know that Valentine's Day is right around the corner, and I thought about putting together a class or some sort of offering for people to attend or purchase in honor of that Hallmark holiday. But I have not. I'm going to do a series on the podcast about relationships, and it's just stuff that I like to talk about anyway. And so Valentine's Day, the Hallmark holiday as it is prompting me to sort of go back through some old material, maybe fold in some new material, and talk about the stuff I like to talk about, which is how to connect with yourself and how to connect with others in a wholehearted way, without armor, without protection, without sabotage. And so that's what season 2 is going to be about to start. So episode 1 today, we're going to talk about needs and wounds. And so that's going to be the bulk of what I talk about, but I'm looking at some notes. But the reason I like to talk about relationships, and so this is a little bit of a story, you may have heard this in my intro for episode 1, but when I first went into mental health as a profession, I started out with wanting to help families impacted by addiction or people impacted by addiction. Well, after working with a couple people and a couple families, like, okay, I got to look at relationships. Okay, wow, what's underneath addiction? Oftentimes trauma and disconnection. How can I help people connect more with themselves? And so to me, relationships just is sort of the quality of our life. If our relationships are happy, healthy, connected, then we feel more connected and joyful and healthy. And that's not always easy. So it's pretty common for like some of my coaching clients to contact me and say, yes, I want to talk about work. I have some leadership challenges. I'm leveling up, whatever. And then we talk about work stuff, but we also talk about personal because it's interconnected. I've had people who are really successful in business before, CEOs, whatnot. They come talk to me and they're like, yeah, this is, I've made this much money and I've accomplished this amount of things and this is awesome. And I don't know how to relate with my wife and my marriage is on the verge of divorce. And it's so those moments when people contact me. And so I'm typically working with them about their internal connection and their internal relationship with themselves, as well as how do they do the interpersonal, what happens between them and someone else. So that's the stuff that gets me fired up, and hopefully that comes through in the work that I share with you. And so one of the ways that people end up working with someone, seeking that or arriving in that place, is usually one or two things, positive or negative. So on the positive side, it could be that they have a growth mindset and they're also in a place where they have enough safety and support that they want to like level up or go back and sort of heal the things they've just been coping and trying to deal with to get by. And on the other hand, there's folks that would never want to reach out or don't want to spend the money or the time or the energy or whatever, but they have reached a pain point or a crisis where they can no longer do what they've always done. They need some new resources and need some new support. So that's typically how people find themselves in a therapist or a coach office. And it's certainly when I found myself looking for help before too. It's just what humans do, hashtag. And I will add that when people are strangely in a place of safety, meaning they've been through something challenging, it could have been a couple months, it could have been decades, whatever the length of time, and they finally have come up for air, their nose is above the water, in fact, their shoulders have risen above, maybe they're like lounging on a floaty. That is oftentimes when there's enough safety for them to then feel whatever it is they've had to sort of put a lid on and just cope with life. And so that can be really disorienting and surprising and a huge trigger for people to be like, I thought I made it to the other side. Now, why am I having all these feelings? Now I'm having all these reactions. So if that's you, you're not alone. It happens to everybody because, again, hashtag human. And then lately, a couple weeks ago, I saw a meme on social media that's like, yeah, that sums up relationship work to a T. And it was Dr. Mark Hyman. He's into functional medicine. I follow him. But the quote on his meme, I'm going to read it, said, the majority of arguments between couples are around three main areas. One, control and power. Y'all know I like to talk about that. Two, care and closeness. And three, respect and recognition. And so if you don't feel like there's a good balance of that for yourself with your significant people, whether that's people you're partnered with, people you're parenting, whoever you're in relationship with, there's going to be a power struggle and there's going to be unmet needs. So that's why we're talking about needs, and we're also going to talk about wounds. So I will say, bird's eye view, like when I listen to someone's narrative of their life story or events that have brought them in, and we start kind of digging a little bit deeper, it usually boils down to some beliefs about themselves, about others, about the world. And the two most common pots are, am I lovable and am I good enough? I mean, if I could just magic erase that out of everyone's psyche, I think the world would be so much more positive. But it's an individual process of sort of digging deep and removing socialization messages and reclaiming your inner truth. Subject for future podcasts, I'm sure. So that was interesting. Okay, so when I meet with couples, and I say that slowly because I've not been taking couples the last year or so. I've just been working with adult individuals. People ask me to see their kids. I'm like, nope, don't want to do that. Can you work with a couple? Nope, I don't want to do that. And I've done that before. And I enjoy it, but oftentimes it's harder because each time you add a person, you add several layers. So sometimes what's happening with an adolescent, for instance, is not so much about the adolescent, but about the family context and the parental units and what's happening in school and things I can't control, right? And the same thing with couples. I used to do a ton of couples work. And then honestly, I took a break for a while because I was married and not happily married, and I just didn't feel aligned. And then I was going through the divorce process. And now I'm like 5 years out after my divorce. And I'm like, okay, we can go back to the relationship stuff. I still enjoy talking about it. So that's a little backstory about why I'm talking about relationship stuff today. I have some new folks I'm working with. So when they come, one of the things I typically ask them would be, I have a ton of questions, but one thing I think about, like one framework is, what are your needs? What are your dreams? What are your fears? And what are your wounds? So like in a session, I want to know, hey, what are you fearful of about engaging in therapy or coaching? What experiences have you had with someone in the past? Kind of like get to know you questions. How can I be most helpful? What are some landmines I need to be mindful of? And so those 4 things are super important. Everyone has needs. And if they go unattended, it's going to create burdens, wounds, and resentment, which doesn't help relationship satisfaction. And wounds, because we're human, right? Hashtag human, things are going to happen that we can't predict or plan for. And there's going to be injury or loss. There's going to be something that leaves a heart boo-boo, so to speak. So there's that. And then dreams. Dreams is what motivates us, right? Like we all have our heart and our soul and our spirit brought into this world with our own special gifts. We have this calling that we're here to do. And I'm not saying it has to be like this big, famous, notorious, even like it doesn't have to be larger than life calling, but it's an honoring of your essence of your heart, who you are and how you want to be. So, and so when people come together in a relationship, oftentimes they have a dream about how they'd like that relationship to be, how they'd like it to feel, what kinds of behaviors they'd like to engage in or not, what service the relationship will be for each person, and maybe even larger than that. A lot of people really enjoy that their relationship not only nourishes and feeds them, but it's a source of for other people. So so the dreams that you have for yourself and for your partnership or your children, whatever relationship we're talking about. And so it's important to know these things because needs, your wounds, fears, and dreams can drive connection when you're aware of what they are, and you can be vulnerable and assertive, and then, of course, reciprocally received by the person you're communicating with. That's great. And when you're not, it can often drive lack of communication, poor communication, conflict, and power struggles. So oftentimes when I work with couples, they'll start talking about a subject or a topic, and I'll listen, and then I'll pause and I'll interrupt, be like, yep, I'm doing it again. I'm interrupting because we need to shift from the content of what we're talking about and get into the dynamic, the process of how you two are communicating. So that's something to be mindful of. To get out of conflict, you need to listen for dreams. You need to listen for fears. You need to be mindful of wounds, proceed accordingly. Okay, so if what I have said already overwhelms you, and if you're in a relationship, married or not married, maybe you're premarital, maybe you've been married for decades or partnered, don't want to exclude anybody here. If you would like to have a little bit of a tune-up or a checkup, I want to put a plug in for a program called Prepare Enrich. I will put the link to the website in the notes below, but basically www.prepare-enrich.com. And you can look for me as your facilitator. Reach out to me, we'll set that up. And what that looks like is each person of the partnership takes an online assessment, and then the results get summarized and sent to me. And we have meetings where we talk about the strengths that you two have in your relationship and the growth areas where there may be some disagreement, or topics maybe haven't even been discussed before ever, or areas where you might need some help navigating how to communicate some of the differences. So that's a lot of fun. So if you're interested in that, Prepare Enrich, reach out. Okay, so that's sort of the preliminary intro. I'm looking at my notes again. Gonna take a little drink. You'll let that settle in, guys. So needs and wounds. So needs, everyone has needs, and there's two kind of buckets of needs that I want you guys to be mindful of. So again, this is helpful whether you're an adult in an adult-adult relationship, whether you're parenting, if you're doing some inner child work, you have like me, I have a CPTSD orientation from my childhood. So sometimes we have to go back and reparent those spaces and places inside of us where needs weren't met and wounds were created. Okay, so needs. You've got like survival needs, which are the basic needs, and then you've got emotional dependency needs, which are really the primary needs for love and esteem. Okay, so we'll start with the survival needs, and those are the basics like clothes, shelter, food, medical care, safety, and protection. And so generations past had messaging about you just check the boxes and make sure their needs are met, children to be seen and not heard. And there wasn't quite that emphasis on meeting emotional needs like there is now. So this is progress. So we really want to do both. And if you don't meet those basic needs, the food, shelter, clothing, medical attention, safety, and protection, then what happens is a child doesn't feel safe. And when they don't feel safe, they don't engage in play or in as much play. And play is how they learn. And so essentially, when you have a young being who doesn't feel safe, they're not allowed to engage in developmentally appropriate expansion and exploring of their world. And instead, they begin to develop skills to protect themselves, is the best way to put it. I like to refer to that as adaptive functioning or coping. Other people call it like psychological defense mechanisms, which sounds so psychobabble to me. But it's skills, it's behaviors that people will pick up and adopt, if you will, for survival. And they'll use those coping skills, survival skills, protective skills, until they no longer work for them, and sometimes beyond that. So the people that work with me are like, hey, guess what? I've done the research. I've been coping like this for a hot minute, and it's no longer working. And it's causing actually other problems. And so we need a new plan. So survival needs, basic safety needs, which include safety and protection. Safety, safety, safety. Hard to develop and have a relationship without safety. Okay, then the emotional dependency needs kind of fall into a couple of different areas. So that would be time, attention, affection, and direction. And interestingly, affection tends to be an area where families miss the boat. So they'll hit those basic needs, but they'll miss some of these more emotional ones, and especially the affection one. So let's get into that. So time for a developing person equals love. If someone takes time to be with them, that means love. In their childlike minds, it doesn't matter if their parents are working 2 or 3 jobs or have a physical illness or whatever adult issues that they have. They just see that they're not available. And not available oftentimes doesn't mean love. So with taking time, it's not so much the amount, but it's that it's consistent and that it's quality time. So I have a friend who is married, and the couple spent some time apart for a while for work, and now they're back together in the same city, in the same home. And I said, okay, prepare yourself. This is going to be a transition. And recommendation is that you talk about the frequency and rituals of how you want to spend time together. So I'll say more on that in future episodes. So quality and consistency with time. That's number 1. Number 2 would be, again, these are emotional dependency needs, human needs, attention. Attention conveys that you have worth and you have value. So you show attention, not only with time, but also by showing interest in what they're interested in, taking them seriously, being curious about who they are and how they think and what they feel and what they're into. And so it always reminds me of that acronym I've shared before, RARE, attuned, responsive, engage. So this is like you're bringing your full self, good eye contact, heart to heart connection, your body's oriented, eye contact, listening, meeting those bids for connection. If you don't know what bids for connections are, check out season 1. I did an episode on bids for connection. It's John Gottman's work, by the way. And so if a child's needs for attention are not met, they will try to get their needs for attention met in other ways. And those are usually more bids for connection and attention, or it's protest behavior. And that can be acted in or acted out. So, and oftentimes, I got to say too, children will pick up a family role like hero or family scapegoat or black sheep or the mascot or the the lost child. So they'll figure out a way to minimize harm and maximize needs, but it's not ideal. Okay, so I always think about like people whose attention needs weren't met typically are those, especially the ladies I work with. They're pleasing, they're performing, they're producing. They've got to hustle and perform to be seen, to be heard, to be acknowledged, to be wanted. And then, of course, on the opposite side, we have sort of the rebel who acts out and like resists and wants to go their own way and doesn't, I don't care. So that can be a person who has a part of them that kind of feels like avoidant in their attachment style, which again is a whole nother episode. And then, of course, so we're talking about people who act things out, but you can also act in and just shut down. And it's another way of, there's all kinds of things people do when they act in. That's coping, not healing or thriving. So we have time, attention. Number 3 is affection. And affection equals approval. That's what it feels like to a developing person. So displays of affection are how approval messages are sent. And without enough affection, they'll engage in behaviors to try to get more attention and more affection. So I think affection is important for everyone. COVID showed us that when we're in isolation, especially like people that are single, aren't living with someone else, don't have a pet, don't have a child to cuddle up next to, that need for touch went unmet. Our geriatric population, it's a huge issue for them. They don't get touched, and that's a human need to receive touch. Some of the men that I worked with in the past and known, they equate intimacy with just physical sex, because that's the only way that they get affection. That was the way that they were reared. Their family wasn't affectionate. They didn't hold hands. They didn't snuggle on the couch. They didn't hug. And so penetration is the only way then to get physical touch. And that's a disservice, I think. So something to think about. And obviously intimacy, sex, and affection is several other episodes. So think about how comfortable you are with giving and receiving affection. I think a good litmus test for that, even though it's not physical touch, is how someone gives and receives a compliment. Many people that I work with have difficulty receiving a compliment. And that's usually a tell that some of their needs weren't met and that there's some developmental wounds. Okay. So we're on to number 4. So 1 was time, 2 was attention, 3 was affection, 4 is direction, which is part of a parent's job to provide guidance and to instill confidence. We are, as little human babies, we are born with limited capacity. And we're dependent on our caregiver for all the things, the basic needs, the emotional needs. And then as we develop, we need to be socialized. And that requires a particular set of skills that not every caregiver has available to them. So in an ideal situation, a caregiver is going to be available and approachable, which means that they're patient, they're tolerant, they're affectionate, and they're going to be able to teach and demonstrate, like in discipline. So I want to say discipline means to teach. It doesn't mean to punish. So older generations had that thought or belief about discipline equals punishment. It's to teach. And to teach, you need to be in relationship, attuned, responsive, and engaged. Otherwise, there are no brains online to connect with. There's going to be nothing sticking because their nervous system's activated, which I've talked about before, and I'm sure I'll talk about again. Okay. So most of us, as you all know, I've said Generation X, we were raised with a lot of criticism, shame, sometimes even in contempt. So that stuff tends to get passed down from generation to generation until the dynamic is changed. So I'm here to help shift that dynamic for sure. Healthy feedback comes from a place of love. So heart-centered, not agenda-driven, heart-centered. Tolerance, and then the absence of shame, criticism, or contempt. Criticism, by the way, is sort of like, hey, what you're doing right now is wrong. That behavior is wrong. Contempt is like, you are wrong. Something is wrong with you. And again, if I had a magic eraser that could magically erase that message that people have received that there's something wrong with them, I would do that. Okay. So we need relationship before there can be any logical connection. Old school belief used to be you need to discipline in the teaching moment or you'd lose it. It's not the way our brains are wired. So we need regulation, we need relationship, and then teaching. And here's a note too that I wanted to share. Sometimes parents can be too, you can never be too nurturing, but you can be too controlling or too fear-based in terms of being overprotective or over-involved. And when that happens, that's really a parent issue where they are not comfortable handling discomfort, especially failure. So that's something I wanted to mention, because when that happens, the child internalizes messages and beliefs related to their competence. And instead of feeling confident and having a sense of mastery, they struggle with decision-making, shame, fear, and anxiety, which again, wish I could magic erase that off of some people that I care for and care about. So number 5 of the needs, the emotional needs, is discipline, which equals character development. And for that, we need structures, so routines, boundaries, clear limits, consistent limits, loving limits. We need to establish values, and we need to model as adults the things that are important, such as values, such as grooming, such as communication. That's all part of teaching character. And again, children who don't know where boundaries are gotta love getting a call while you're recording. So people who don't know where the boundaries are don't feel safe. And then again, that's when protective coping mechanisms kick in. Okay, so 2 buckets of needs: basic, check the box, basic needs, and then the emotional needs. And that's where I see a lot of people really needing to develop their emotional intelligence and their social intelligence. All right, drink break before the next part, which will be the last part of this episode. All right, so when needs are not met, or something traumatic happens that shouldn't have happened, like the death of a parent, or other things didn't happen that should have, so life, trauma stuff, and there's not appropriate support and enough support for that person who's experiencing that loss or shock or trauma, whatever you want to call it, that's when you have a wound. And that's what hurts. One of the models of therapy I follow, a lot of you guys know I like IFS, Internal Family Systems, but I also like NORM, Neuro Emotional Relational Model. And when I was reading their book, like the first book in years, just released this summer, talked a lot about it and helping clients who talk about it hurting to drill down to see what it is. And I will say that in my own healing work, like when I journal, it hurts. I know it's something I'm like, what is this it I'm talking about? Well, the it would be the wound, it would be the pain. And so that's something to be mindful about. So wounds hurt. And when there's a hurt, then again, those protective mechanisms, coping mechanisms come on board to try to prevent that from ever happening again. So there will be protective parts of you that have made a solemn vow, have marching orders. Don't ever let that happen again. We will not be like that. Okay. And when you maybe have a human moment, your capacity is overwhelmed and you can't hold that vow or you can't fulfill those orders, then you're going to have more reactive parts of you that try to take you away from the discomfort of that failure to protect yourself. And that usually also leaves you open to feeling the pain of the wound. So that's the kind of stuff you come to get support around. And so I think talking about wounds is important because if you're in a relationship with someone, they need to be, first and foremost, the primary caretaker of themselves, their needs, their wounds. But if you're in a partnership with them, or you've adopted a child, or you're raising a child, or you're leading someone at work, it helps to be mindful of what those ouches are so that you can be respectful in how you approach things that are going to touch up or bounce up or rub up against the wound. So that's important. So there's a couple definitions I wanted to share with you. It comes from a book. I think it's called God. I'll try to put that in the notes too. But 3 things that the author mentioned in the book would be your emotional heritage, your emotional philosophy, and your emotional vulnerability. So kind of like I said before, emotional heritage is about how we were treated in the past and how that treatment impacted us, like literally left an impact on our developing system. And it also includes the way that the people around us acted when they emoted. Okay, so by the way, emotion is energy in action. And so if it's supercharged, I've heard the word zingy, that resonates, sticky, whatever, then people tend to react to that. So how did people in your family allow or not allow emotions and the expression of emotion? How was that received? And again, that emotional heritage travels across generations because it's modeled. Okay, emotional philosophy is what your own family believed about the expression of emotion. And so that varies. I mean, each family is like its own little culture. All right. So humor might be invited and celebrated in a family, and in another family, it might be a sign of disrespect. Anger might be seen as allowed and an expression of passion and excitement in one family, and in another, it could mean that all hell's about to break loose and everyone needs to run for cover. And so I like to say, let's get clear on what the basic emotions are. I call them the primary colors. Like if you think about your original box of crayons when you were a child, it had like just the primary colors in it. And I think about some of the emotions that way, like happy, mad, sad, scared, to me are the primary emotions. And so asking your significant other how their family allowed, didn't allow, express, worked with those emotions can be really informative if you don't already know. Okay, and then enduring vulnerability. So again, it's the wounds, it's the hot buttons. So if you know there's something that, whether you consciously or unconsciously press up against something in your partner or your child, their hot button, that's their wound. And for those of us who are no longer children and are adults, we are responsible. We have the ability to respond now as an adult to unmet needs and undertended wounds. And so when we have our hot button pressed, that's called being triggered. That's called feeling activation. And IFS is called a trailhead. Because you are being shown something from the past that keeps showing up in the present, but with more magnification and more intensity and energy than what one might expect given the present. So if you look at it through the lens of the past, one of my mentors said that has long legs there, then it tends to make more sense. And it's something that needs some tending to. That's typically when you reach out to a professional for support. If you are, if you haven't yet been able to meet those needs or tend those wounds, you might need some assistance with that. And that being said, we are great self-healers. Sometimes we just need to get out of our own way a little bit or be in a condition where we can let down the armoring and really create space and place for us to connect with ourselves. So it is interesting to think about. Sidebar, I was listening to someone I follow who does group container programs, talking about the pros and cons of individual work versus group work. And I think all of it's cool and all of it's fine. But one of the points they made was a lot of people who have protective mechanisms feel safer processing on their own privately. That's the only time that they can really let it down and let things out. Whereas other people really need to be witnessed and to be held in a space because they never received that. So you got to know what you need for your system. And that's part of the discovery process of working with someone. Like one session with one person, like the pattern of things might be very similar, but the unique flavor that they need, that is the special sauce of working with people, to know that the unique medicine is already inside of them and we're just helping to unlock that. Okay, what else did I want to say about that? I think that was it on the enduring abilities. Oh, vulnerabilities. And so some of this information, y'all, I'm pulling from, needed to whip my whistle, hold on. Some of this information that I'm pulling for season 2 is from a program I put together years and years ago. I have a 16-year-old, he was a baby, I think. So over 10 years ago, when I lived in St. Louis, it was called HEART. Ooh, I'm actually forgetting the acronym in this moment. I'll tell you another time. And so from that program, I mean, it was like a 55-page manual. We did it in 3 nights. It was a lot of fun. But one of the things I put in there, of course, there were several, clearly, was this chart. And so I'm just going to read these out to you so you can sort of self-assess for yourself. And then maybe if you have like your partner in mind, these are common emotional injuries or wounds. And so this might be a time to pause and grab some pen and paper or take some notes because it's hard to articulate. And it's hard to identify and articulate when you don't know what the list is. So I think the list can be really helpful. So here they are. Not having enough control or power. No one wants to be dominated over. And people want to know that they are contained and safe. So not having enough control, being excluded or abandoned. You can be excluded in your own family. Triangulation is something that happens in families where there's narcissistic abuse. It's a coercive control tactic. Not cool, not fun, very shaming, very harmful. Abandoned, that can be consciously or unconsciously, any child that was put up for adoption, even if they're happily adopted by a family that has been longing to adopt a child, that child experienced abandonment from their biological parent. Facts. So when, divorce happens, death happens, things like that, that is felt as an abandonment. Okay, so not having enough control I mentioned, but also being controlled or coerced. I think I said that. Being unfairly treated, any kind of abuse, okay? Physical, sexual, emotional, psychological, social, financial, medical, spiritual. I think there might be 1 or 2 I missed, but that's a lot of them. Okay, there's a lot of ways that a person can be abused. And abuse is not fun, but at least there's usually, and I don't mean to minimize, I just want to say that when I work with folks, abuse is like something that you usually you can see it, it feels more tangible compared to neglect, which is usually like this invisible thing that people can't put their finger on, but creates just as much harm, if not more so than abuse. And then oftentimes they travel together. Quite the combination. So, so being abused and then not receiving affection or signs of affection, we need human touch, appropriate human touch. Not being accepted for who you are. So I think about folks from the LGBTQ population, for instance, like, or folks that are transgendered, and they're coming out to their family and they're not accepted. Or let's say you have very like extroverted parents and you're an introverted child and they don't accept that. So it can be really seemingly minor differences, or it can be major differences that seem value-based to people, but not being accepted. Big wound. Being betrayed travels with a lot of this, as well as being rejected, humiliated, ignored, or neglected. And there's some more. So to wrap this up, I guess what I would encourage you to think about is, for yourself, of the needs, the basic needs, safety and protections in there, and then emotional needs. What needs have been overdeveloped, underdeveloped, or optimally or appropriately skillful, meaning right in the window. And then of those wounds, which are usually those unmet needs plus some extra something or an absence of something, where are you with that? And then when you have clarity on that and you address that and you heal that instead of cope with it, then you're in a better place to have the kind of relationship, or to create the kind of relationship, at least from your end, with someone that's important to you. And so part of the reason I went through that list of wounds is so that you can also have that conversation with your significant other. Like, what wounds are your hot button triggers? What's activating to you? What needs are super important to you? And so as the series continues, we'll talk more about dreams. We'll talk more about fear, and we'll talk about a whole lot of communication and other things that can, like information that can really help you developmentally up your skill set for your own inner healing, as well as your interpersonal connections. So I think I'm feeling complete around this episode. Just thinking about it. Needs, wounds, fears, dreams. How can you grow the positive? How can you heal the hurt? And if you're not sure, that's when I'd for sure invite you to reach out to Reset. Thanks for listening. And tune back in for episode 2 whenever I drop that.